The priest's voice thundered through the church. "Stop this wedding right now!" The entire room went silent. The music stopped mid-note, the guests froze, and my heart almost stopped beating. My fiancé looked at me in shock as the priest slowly raised his shaking hand and pointed, not at us, but at my mother. "You can't let this marriage happen," he said firmly, "not until she tells the truth about who she really is." Gasps filled the room. My mother's face turned white. She didn't speak. She didn't even move. I felt my knees weaken as everyone turned to look at her. That was the moment I realized. My mother had been hiding something her entire life, and whatever it was about to tear mine apart. If you want to know how one secret changed everything I believed about love, family, and truth, stay till the end. And before we begin, make sure you subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Ava Rowan. I'm 26 years old, and I've always believed in simple things: honesty, love, and second chances. I grew up in a small coastal town in Maine, where everyone knew each other's names and secrets. Everyone except my mother's. Laura Rowan, my mom, raised me on her own after my father passed away before I was born. At least, that's what she always told me. She worked 2 jobs, teaching piano lessons during the day and waiting tables at night, to make sure I never went without anything. She was strong, graceful, and quiet. Too quiet sometimes. I was her whole world, and she was mine. But there were moments, small ones, that didn't make sense. Times she would stare out the window late at night, or flinch when someone mentioned Chicago, a city we never talked about. I used to think it was just grief. Now I know better. The morning of my wedding, sunlight poured into the little white church on the hill. The scent of flowers filled the air as my mother helped me adjust my lace veil. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she fixed a strand of my hair. "Thanks, Mom," I smiled. "You're shaking. Are you nervous?" She forced a laugh. "A little. Every mother is nervous when her only child is getting married." Standing across from me in the mirror was the woman who had been both my mother and my mystery. I had asked her so many times about my father, and each time she gave the same soft answer. Some stories hurt too much to tell, and I never pushed harder. I thought her silence came from pain. I never imagined it came from fear. My fiancé, Ethan Blake, was waiting at the altar, a kind, patient man who made me believe in forever. He came from a wealthy, respected family that had lived in our town for generations. His parents adored me, and for the first time, my mother seemed genuinely happy about someone in my life. But as the ceremony was about to begin, she suddenly pulled me close. Her voice was low, almost trembling. "Ava, whatever happens today, promise me you'll remember that I love you more than anything." I smiled, brushing it off. "Mom, you're scaring me. What's going to happen?" She didn't answer. She just kissed my forehead and whispered, "Just remember what I said." Moments later, the music started. The church doors opened. I took a deep breath, my heart full of hope, and walked down the aisle toward Ethan. Everyone stood. The light hit the stained glass windows. Everything looked like a dream. But halfway through that aisle, I saw the priest's face. His smile had faded. His eyes were filled with something heavy, something like recognition. And when he raised his hand and shouted for the wedding to stop, my perfect life shattered before my eyes. The moment the priest's words echoed through the church, everything fell apart. The music stopped. The guests turned in confusion, and a wave of uneasy whispers rippled through the crowd. I stood frozen at the altar, clutching my bouquet so tightly that the petals began to crumble in my hands. My heart was pounding, and my throat felt dry. Ethan took a step toward the priest, his face pale with disbelief. "Father Donovan," he said firmly, "what are you talking about? What truth?" The priest's eyes were locked on my mother. His hands trembled as he spoke. "I know that woman," he said, his voice heavy. "Years ago, I saw her in Chicago. She can't let this marriage happen without telling the truth about who she is." A low gasp filled the air. My mother's bouquet slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a dull thud. I turned to her, waiting for her to deny it, to say this was some mistake, but she didn't say a word. Her face had gone completely still, her lips pressed tight. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "What is he talking about?" Ethan looked from me to her, his confusion turning into frustration. His parents stood in the front row, whispering to each other, their eyes narrowing. My stomach churned. I wanted to believe this was all some misunderstanding, but the silence told me it wasn't. The priest stepped forward slowly, his expression torn between guilt and conviction. "Laura Rowan isn't her real name," he said. "I recognized her the moment she walked in. I was a young priest in Chicago when her name made the news. She disappeared 25 years ago after a man died under suspicious circumstances." My knees went weak. I turned to my mother, desperate for her to say something, anything, but she stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. Ethan's father rose from his seat, his face tightening. "What are you accusing her of?" he demanded. The priest swallowed hard. "I'm not accusing her of anything. I'm saying she owes her daughter the truth before this marriage continues." The guests began murmuring louder. Some pulled out their phones. Others just stared at my mother like she was a ghost. I felt dizzy, like the room was spinning. I could barely hear my own voice when I said, "Mom, please, say something." Laura finally looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Ava," she whispered, "I didn't want you to find out this way." Ethan looked at her sharply. "Find out what?" Before she could answer, a man's voice called from the back of the church. "She's lying." Every head turned. A tall man in his 50s stepped forward from the crowd. He had silver hair, a wrinkled face, and eyes that looked both furious and broken. He pointed straight at my mother. "I know who you are. You vanished after my brother died. You left us to live with the blame." A heavy silence fell. The air in the church felt thick. My chest ached. I turned toward the man. "Who are you?" He hesitated, his voice trembling. "My name is Richard Blake." Ethan froze. His last name was Blake, too. "Wait," I said, my voice shaking. "Blake? Are you related to—" "Yes," he interrupted. "My brother was Daniel Blake. He died the night before he was supposed to marry that woman." I felt the ground slip beneath me. I looked at my mother, her face pale as paper. My mother was engaged to Ethan's uncle, the man who died mysteriously, the man whose death she was accused of causing. The room erupted in whispers. Ethan stepped back, his eyes wide. "That's not possible," he said, almost pleading. "You're saying my fiancé's mother was engaged to my uncle?" My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's true." The priest closed his eyes as if the weight of the truth had finally crushed him. I could see tears forming behind his glasses. "I tried to forget," he said softly, "but I couldn't let another wedding begin under a lie." Ethan's father shouted from the front pew, "Enough of this! You're destroying lives with rumors." But my mother shook her head slowly. "They're not rumors." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I loved Daniel, more than anything, but his father didn't approve. He wanted Daniel to marry someone from a powerful family. The night Daniel told him he wouldn't go through with it, there was a fight. Daniel didn't survive. I was blamed, and I ran. I changed my name. I built a new life for Ava." The church went completely silent. Ethan stood there, stunned, his face pale. I could feel my heart tearing apart. Everything I believed about my mother, her kindness, her pain, her silence, it all made sense now. But one thought kept running through my mind. "You knew, Mom," I said softly. "You knew Ethan's last name was Blake." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "When you first told me his name, I thought it couldn't be the same family. But when I met his parents, I recognized his father's eyes. I wanted to tell you, but I was terrified. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe the past would stay buried." I stepped back, shaking my head. "You let me fall in love with him without telling me any of this?" Her voice broke completely. "I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to pay for my mistakes." Ethan's voice rose, filled with anger and pain. "So this whole time you knew who we were?" She looked at him, her lips trembling. "I didn't plan it, Ethan. I just couldn't stop it once I saw how much you loved her." No one spoke after that. The guests avoided eye contact, unsure what to do. The priest stood silently at the altar, staring at the floor. I felt like my world had shattered in front of everyone I knew. The truth was finally out. But it wasn't over. It was only the beginning of something much darker, something none of us were prepared for. The silence after my mother's confession felt heavier than the church walls themselves. The guests had stopped whispering. The music still hadn't resumed, and every eye in the room was fixed on us. I stood at the altar, my hands trembling, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. Ethan looked as lost as I felt. His father was staring at my mother with pure disgust, and the man from the back, Richard Blake, still hadn't sat down. I could feel everyone waiting, holding their breath, expecting me to say something, but for a long moment, I couldn't speak. Finally, I turned to my mother. "You said Daniel died after a fight," I said quietly. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" Her lips trembled. She took a small step forward. "Ava, please, not here." "No, Mom," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to echo. "You've hidden the truth my entire life. You owe it to me to finish it right here, right now." The words came out stronger than I expected. People shifted in their seats. I could feel their eyes move from me to her like a slow wave. Ethan looked at me, unsure whether to reach for my hand or back away. I didn't blame him. None of us knew who to trust anymore. My mother covered her face for a moment, trying to steady herself. When she looked up again, her tears had dried, but her voice was heavy and hoarse. Daniel's death wasn't an accident. It was a tragedy built on pride and control. The priest stepped forward cautiously. "Laura," he said softly, "you don't have to carry this alone anymore." She nodded weakly, then turned toward the guests. "Daniel and I wanted to get married," she said, "but his father refused to give his blessing. He said I wasn't good enough for their family. I was from a working-class home, and Daniel was his only son. He wanted a political marriage that would benefit the Blake name." She paused, glancing at Ethan's father, who stood motionless in the front row. When Daniel refused to obey, his father became violent. Daniel went to confront him that night. I followed him because I was afraid something would happen. When I got there, I heard shouting, glass breaking, and then I found Daniel lying on the floor. His father called the police before I could speak. He said I pushed Daniel down the stairs. They believed him. I was 23 and terrified. I ran before they could arrest me. The guests gasped again, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Ethan's mother started crying quietly, while his father clenched his fists, staring at the ground. The man who had always been so composed, so dignified, suddenly looked like someone who had spent his life living a lie. I felt tears sting my eyes, but I couldn't cry. I was too numb. "So, all these years," I said softly, "you've been living under a false name, pretending that life never happened." She nodded. "I didn't want you to grow up as the daughter of a criminal. I wanted you to have a chance at happiness." I shook my head. "But the truth always finds a way out, doesn't it?" The priest took a deep breath and looked toward Ethan's father. "Mr. Blake, I remember that night. I was there at the rectory next door. I saw you arrive before the police did. I didn't speak up then because I was young and afraid, but I saw the bruises on your hands. I heard Daniel shouting that he would expose your corruption. When I found Laura crying beside him, you told me to stay silent or I'd lose my position. I've lived with that guilt for 25 years. The entire room gasped. Ethan turned sharply toward his father. "Dad, is that true?" Mr. Blake's face turned red. "That's enough," he snapped. "You have no proof of anything." But Father Donovan didn't back down. "The truth doesn't need proof when it's been buried under guilt this long. You know what you did." Ethan's mother suddenly stood, trembling. "Tell them the truth, Robert," she said, her voice breaking. "Tell them what really happened that night." He didn't answer. His silence said everything. Ethan took a slow step backward, shaking his head in disbelief. All this time, our family's reputation, our pride, it was built on a lie? The tension in the room was unbearable. My mother turned to me, tears streaming down her face again. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she said, "but I knew that if the truth came out, it would destroy everything you loved. I thought silence was safer." I looked at her, my chest tightening. "Silence didn't protect us, Mom. It only delayed the pain." She dropped to her knees in front of me, her voice trembling. Then let me make it right. Let me tell everything. I can't live another day with this secret. The priest nodded slowly. Then we do it now, here, before God. I helped her stand. The guests watched in stunned quiet as my mother walked back toward the altar. Her steps were slow, but steady. She faced the cross at the front of the church, then turned back to everyone watching. Daniel didn't die because of me, she said clearly. He died because he stood up to a man who couldn't stand losing control of his family. Her voice was calm now, almost peaceful, and I won't be silent anymore. Ethan walked toward her, his face full of heartbreak. I don't know what to say, he whispered. I looked at him and said, then don't say anything. Just listen. The truth deserves that much. That was the moment I realized everything had changed. There was no wedding anymore, no aisle to walk down, no vows to exchange, only the truth, finally standing in the same room where lies had once lived. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to hear it. The room was utterly still. For a long time, no one dared to move or speak. The church, once filled with music, laughter, and the scent of flowers, now felt like a courtroom. My mother stood near the altar, her hands clasped together, her face pale but determined. The truth was finally spilling out after decades of silence, and there was no turning back. Father Donovan's voice broke the tension. Laura, he said softly, you've carried this burden for too long. Tell them what really happened that night. My mother nodded, taking a shaky breath. That night, Daniel went to confront his father about me. He told him he wouldn't be controlled anymore, that he was leaving to start a new life with me. I followed him because I knew how dangerous his father's temper was. When I got to the house, the fight had already begun. I heard shouting from the study, words full of anger and hatred. I ran inside just as Daniel fell. He was lying at the bottom of the stairs, bleeding and barely breathing. His father was standing over him, shaking with rage. She paused, tears filling her eyes, but she kept going. I screamed and ran to Daniel. He tried to speak, but he couldn't. His father grabbed me and told me to leave. When I refused, he said if I didn't disappear, he'd make sure everyone believed I killed him. I was young, terrified, and grieving. So I ran. I changed my name, started over, and promised myself I would never let that world touch my child. A collective gasp moved through the crowd. Every eye in the room turned to Ethan's father, Robert Blake, who stood frozen, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly. Ethan took a step forward. Dad, he said quietly, tell me she's lying. Robert's lips parted, but no words came out. His silence was louder than any confession. Ethan's mother began to sob softly into her hands. Father Donovan looked straight at Robert. You remember what you told me that night, he said, his voice shaking. You told me Daniel's death was an accident, that it was an argument that went too far. You begged me not to tell the police what I saw, because it would destroy your family name. I was young and cowardly, and I obeyed. But I've lived with that guilt every day since. Robert's face hardened, but the guilt in his eyes betrayed him. I did what I had to do, he finally said, his voice rough. Daniel lost control. He pushed me first. I didn't mean for him to fall. When it happened, I panicked. I thought no one would believe me, so I blamed her. A sharp murmur rippled through the church. Ethan stared at his father, disbelief twisting his face. You destroyed her life, he said, his voice breaking. You made her run. You made everyone think she was a murderer. Robert looked down, unable to meet his son's eyes. I thought it would protect the family, he said weakly. Everything I built was for you. Ethan shook his head. You didn't build anything. You just buried the truth and hoped it would stay there. I stood still, my heart breaking for both of them. For Ethan, realizing his family's wealth was built on lies, and for my mother, who had carried the blame all alone. My whole life I had admired her strength without knowing the pain it came from. Now I finally understood. My mother stepped forward, her voice calm. I didn't come here to destroy anyone. I just wanted my daughter to live free from the shadows I've lived in. But lies have a way of finding light, no matter how deep you bury them. Robert's wife turned to him, her face streaked with tears. You let me live with that lie too, she whispered. I thought she was the villain. I hated her for years. And all this time, it was you. Robert tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He sank slowly into the pew, his hands covering his face. Father Donovan turned to the congregation. This woman was never guilty. I knew the truth back then, but I didn't have the courage to speak. Today, I will not make the same mistake. The church will stand with her, and so will I. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't fear. It was realization. Everyone in that room knew the story that had been whispered for decades was finally being rewritten. Ethan walked over to my mother. His voice was soft, full of regret. I don't know how to fix any of this, he said, but I'm sorry for what my family did to you. My mother gave him a faint smile. You can't fix the past, Ethan. None of us can. But we can stop it from breaking more lives. He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. I wish you'd told me sooner, Ava. I wish I'd known. I took his hand, but it felt heavy between us. Maybe this was how it had to happen, I said quietly. The truth hurts, but lies poison everything they touch. The priest placed a gentle hand on my mother's shoulder. You are free now, Laura, he said kindly. Daniel's name will finally rest in peace, and yours can too. As my mother looked up at the cross, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Relief. She wasn't the quiet, distant woman anymore. She was someone who had faced her past and survived it. Ethan's father was led away by the police later that day after Father Donovan came forward with his written confession from years ago. The story spread quickly through the town, but for once, the truth didn't destroy us. It healed what had been broken. That evening, my mother and I sat together outside the now empty church, the sunset glowing over the ocean. She turned to me and whispered, I never thought I'd see this day. I held her hand and said, You deserve peace, Mom. You've carried enough pain for a lifetime. For the first time in years, she smiled, real, unguarded, and free. The woman who once lived in fear was finally standing in the light. And even though the wedding was over, I realized something far more powerful had happened that day. The truth had found its voice. And for both of us, that was the beginning of everything new. The days after the wedding felt like living in the silence that comes after a storm. The chaos had passed, but everything around me looked different. The church that once echoed with music and laughter now stood empty. The flowers withered, the pews gathering dust. It was strange how one day could hold so much. Love, truth, loss, and freedom, all tangled together. My mother and I moved out of town for a while. She needed space to breathe, and honestly, so did I. For the first time in my life, I saw her without her walls. No fake smiles, no mysterious pauses when the past came up. Just a woman who had survived heartbreak, fear, and years of guilt. We rented a small cottage near the coast, not far from where I grew up, and every evening we'd sit outside with cups of tea, watching the sun dip below the horizon. One evening I asked her, Do you regret running? She thought for a long time before answering. I regret being afraid, she said softly. But if I hadn't run, I wouldn't have had you. You were the one good thing that came out of all the pain. I just wish I'd trusted you enough to tell you the truth sooner. Her words hit me hard. I had spent years believing her distance meant she didn't want to talk about love or loss, when in reality, she was trying to protect me from her ghosts. And maybe, in her own broken way, she had. But fear, I learned, doesn't protect anyone for long. It just delays the healing. The investigation into Daniel Blake's death was reopened after Father Donovan's testimony and the evidence he had kept hidden all those years. Within weeks, Robert Blake was charged with obstruction of justice and involuntary manslaughter. The story spread across local news, and for the first time, my mother's name was cleared. People who once whispered about her started sending letters of apology. Strangers who had judged her without knowing the truth now admired her courage for coming forward. Ethan came by the cottage a month later. I didn't know how to feel when I saw him standing at the door. Part of me still loved him, but another part was afraid of everything that connected us. He looked tired, like he hadn't slept in weeks. I didn't know, he said quietly, as we sat on the porch. I swear, Ava, I didn't know what my father did. I wish I could take it all away. I nodded, not out of anger, but understanding. I know you didn't, I said. This wasn't your fault. But it's hard to love someone when every part of that love reminds you of the pain your family caused. He looked down at his hands. So, this is goodbye? I hesitated before answering. Not forever, just for now. I think we both need time to understand who we are without all the lies. He nodded, his eyes glistening. Then I'll wait, however long it takes. When he left, I felt both heavy and light, like losing something precious but gaining something truer in return. The part of me that once feared being alone was gone. For the first time, I felt grounded in who I was. Weeks turned into months. My mother started teaching piano again, and I began volunteering at a local youth center, helping kids who came from broken homes. I wanted them to understand that your past doesn't define your worth, that even the deepest scars can become stories of strength if you face them instead of running. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, my mother handed me a small envelope. Inside was a letter written in faded ink. It was from Daniel. The date was the day before he died. The letter said, "If anything happens to me, don't let fear control your life. Live it fully. Tell the truth, even when it hurts. Love is only real when it's honest." I read it out loud, and my mother's hands shook as she wiped her tears. "He was trying to protect me," she whispered, "just like I tried to protect you." That night, we lit a candle by the window and let it burn until morning. It was our way of saying goodbye to everything that had haunted us, and hello to the peace we had both been searching for. Eventually, Father Donovan came to visit. He looked older, but lighter, as if a weight had finally lifted off his shoulders. "You both gave me courage," he said. "You made me remember what truth really means." I smiled at him. "Sometimes it takes a lie to make you appreciate honesty." He laughed softly. "And sometimes it takes brave women to remind old men like me of what's right." By the time the first snowfall arrived, the world felt new again. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled us. My mother smiled more. She laughed without guilt. And I started writing again, something I hadn't done in years. I wanted to share stories that healed, not just entertained. Stories that showed how love and truth could rebuild even the most broken lives. As I look back now, I realize that day in the church didn't ruin my life. It revealed it. It showed me that truth, no matter how painful, is always worth facing. It cost me my wedding, but it gave me something far greater, a real understanding of who my mother was and who I was meant to become. Because in the end, family isn't about perfection. It's about facing the storm together, no matter how hard the rain falls. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to my channel and comment below where you're watching from. I love hearing your thoughts and stories. And remember, no matter what secrets life throws your way, the truth will always set you free.